Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is Richard Miranda. I am going to be your panel and your whatever you want to call it, the webinar director or presenter. I just want to give you a couple of things. First of all, I've wanted to introduce myself. Some of you may know me. I have been in the real estate business now for 18 years, of which most of it has been dealing with international buyers and sellers. I started back in 2002, and I got my CIPS designation in 2003, and I became kind of like an international practitioner right after that. Probably around 60%, 65% of my market buyers and sellers are foreign buyers. We'll go into that, the translation or the definition actually of what a foreign buyer is. And I am, for National Association of Realtors, I am what used to be called the Presidential Liaison for Mexico, but the program changed and now it's called Global Ambassadors. So I'm still the Global Ambassador to Mexico. In other words, I represent the NAR president in Mexico for the Mexican Real Estate Association for official matters, as well as 4 other countries like El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Guatemala. And I also represent NAR for official activities in those countries that have signed what we call bilateral agreements with NAR. I'm also a CIPS instructor. I've been a CIPS instructor now for about 6 or 7 years. The CIPS, most of you know, it's that international certification. It's called Certified International Property Specialist. And I'm fluent in Spanish, and that helps, of course. But anyway, that's enough about me. One more thing I wanted to give you as far as housekeeping is concerned. If you will see on your top right screen a little icon with a question mark. If you have a question about a particular topic or item or issue or point that I bring up, please click that icon and it'll open a little window so you can write the question, and we will be addressing those questions after the end of the seminar. We will have time to answer hopefully all the questions after the seminar is over. So let's get started. The question is, how do you handle an inbound foreign transaction? Well, an inbound foreign transaction can mean many things. First of all, let's talk about the session objectives. One of the things we want to do is recognize the benefits of foreign direct investment. We have a little bit of a technical difficulty here. Okay, there we go. Okay. We need to recognize the benefits of FDI. FDI is foreign direct investment in the United States real estate market. We also want to determine the levels of risk. Believe it or not, there is some issues that we need to clarify and reduce the risk of dealing with foreign incoming buyers. One of the most important things that we have to deal with is the education of the buyer. It's all about education, actually. And then we have to review tax laws and issues because it will affect the buyers, and then eventually when that buyer becomes a seller. We're also going to be talking about watching out for red flags. We're going to talk about that, red flags, meaning issues that you need to be aware of so that you can then set expectations with your buyers. All right, so NAR's definition of an international transaction is there's 2 types. Type A is when a non-U.S. citizen, in other words, a foreign person who does not live in the U.S., purchases a property here. And that typically could be a purchase for investment or vacation, or they want to do a second home. And there's many of those. There are many buyers who decide to come in here and they spend Christmas or New Year's or summer, or in many other cultures they have a week off during Lent. Holy Week is called, they call it Semana Santa. So they come in and they spend a lot of time here. Most of them do shopping, and a few of them do touristy things, but most of them are doing shopping. And then there's the type B, which are the non-U.S. citizens who are either recent immigrants that have been here less than 2 years, or what they call non-immigrant visa holders who reside here more than 6 months. For example, people who have been transferred from one country to another one by their employers and have resided here more than 6 months. Some of them have been here for 2 or 3 or 4 years. Typically, these people who end up coming in here as a job transfer end up purchasing a home, because they usually stay for 5 or 6 years and they understand the value of becoming a homeowner and building some equity. And we're going to keep in mind that one of the things that red flags we're going to be talking about later on is the today's buyer or today's foreign buyer may become a foreign seller 5 or 6 years from now. And the residency is going to determine their tax liability. We will talk about that later. Okay. What is the NAR's profile of international buyers, and why should we care about that? Well, because they purchase more expensive properties. Most international buyers spend $260,000 more than domestic buyers. And, you know, do the math. $260,000 means a little bit more money in your paycheck after you close the deal. Good thing, almost half of them pay cash. That means that they close quicker. And you're probably wondering, why do they pay cash? Well, many reasons. One of them is that many of the foreign buyers do have the money, or they do not like to carry mortgages because they come from a culture that does not have mortgage industry or the mortgage technology. So they have the money. The other ones is that it's against their culture to carry a debt like that. So they end up saving the money and then they pay cash for the property. And also, some of them decide that even though they may be able and they may be qualified to purchase with a foreign assistance, or there are actually mortgages. There's some banks here in the Houston area that will do mortgages for foreign buyers, and we can talk about that later. So, but many of them don't have the criteria to be able to offer a paper trail or credit reports that the banks always need to be able to do a mortgage. And this is interesting. 62% came from referrals. If you end up with a buyer from another country and you take excellent care of them, I promise you that you will be referred, because they are so loyal when they're happy with you and they know that you did a great job. 2/3 of them will refer you to their uncles, sisters, brothers, sisters, grandmothers, grandparents, friends, and neighbors. You could end up with a stream of incoming buyers that would probably make you very happy. And here's another thing. Look at that. $454,000 versus $290. The figure in the left, $450,000, is the average purchase of a foreign buyer, and $290 is the average purchase of a domestic buyer. So that's the difference between the foreign buyer and the domestic buyer, which means, of course, you earn more money when you're dealing with a foreign buyer. So what are some of the benefits of the foreign direct investment? Well, it creates jobs. And in our career, we don't have a job, but it creates opportunities. And it also provides capital to support the U.S. markets. All this money comes in from all these other countries. It's going to give more money to be supporting the U.S. markets in many shapes. Anytime you start bringing in cash, stimulates the economy. And, of course, generates real estate and taxes for the government, which is always good. Always need taxes to be paying for the services. Question is, how much they buy? Well, you'll be surprised. In 2017, $153 billion was spent by foreign buyers in the United States. That is a lot of money. $153 billion with a B. In 2018, it dropped slightly to 121 billion. Are you wondering why? Why was there a drop? Well, there's a couple of reasons, and I think that you will see that in the next slide. It dropped to 21. It dropped 21%. So the decline came from three markets, principally from Mexico, Canada, and the UK. Why did we have a drop? Well, exchange rates was one of them. The dollar got stronger, and that made purchases here in the U.S. more expensive. And in some of those countries that had the drop, their currency got weaker internationally, not necessarily because the dollar got stronger, it's because also their currency got weaker. So that had a lot to do with it, their exchange rate. Inventory. Now we all know that we have an inventory shortage for listings, and that has created a problem. Sometimes I'm working with a foreign buyer, and I've discovered that we can't find the right house for them for some reason. And that, unfortunately, is one of the reasons that the market slowed down. Then, of course, there's the international trade and immigration uncertainties. It's a reality that we're facing in the market today. And it is what it is, so we have to deal with that. And then finally, of course, the higher dollar value makes our properties a lot more expensive. Who's buying where? Well, look at that. The Chinese purchased $30 billion of properties in the U.S., followed by the Canadians, who purchased $10 billion. The UK spent $7.3 billion. India and UK were pretty much even, and people from Mexico spent $4.2 billion. In China, the Chinese people ended up buying a lot of properties in California. That's the biggest location where they end up buying. Canadians bought a lot of properties, and believe it or not, of course, you probably would understand that, Arizona and Florida. Why is that? Because it's warm weather, exactly. And the UK people are buying in Florida, usually in the west side of the west coast of Florida, because again, it's much warmer. In India, the South Asian Indians are purchasing also about the same amount. There's a big colony of Indian purchases here in Houston also, just like we have a large colony, large group of Mexicans purchasing here in Houston. 19% of those foreign buyers ended up buying in Florida. And California was second with 14% of that. Remember that $121 billion in the previous slide? That's where it went. 9% came to Texas. And another tidbit of information, international buyers purchased 266, almost 268,000 more homes in 2018. That's a lot of houses. It was a drop, but real estate is a cyclical market, so just because it dropped, and it may drop again, it doesn't mean that it's doomed. It just means that they're cyclical and they will pick up again. So I'm sure that if you're concerned about the drop in buyers, it's temporary, in my opinion, and it's cyclical, and it's going to bounce back, right back. All right, so let's talk about the how. I gave you some numbers to give you the idea of how important and the initiative of the lucrativeness and the profitability of working with foreign buyers. But how do we do it? Well, we have some inbound challenges. One of the things that we have to be aware of is that there's a cultural difference. Most foreign buyers have different attitudes. They have different customs. They have different perceptions. We'd like to call that low context and high context. The low context people are the ones that, like the United States culture, they want things done, they want everything quickly, they don't care about building relationships. All they want to do is the let's get the deal done and move on forward. That's very typical of the buyers from the UK, for example. They have a similar culture as in the US. That's also very true as the Canadians. But since you have a lot of other buyers that come from China and Latin America and other parts of the world, they have a different kind of culture. It's what we call the high context. Those are the folks that believe in relationships. They believe in saving face. They believe in fluid. Time is fluid for them. And they do their decisions in consensus. So keep those things in mind. We're going to be talking about that in more detail in the next few slides. Then, of course, there's the language. It helps if you speak the language of the buyer, but it doesn't have to be absolutely a necessity. I have dealt with people from other countries, Chinese, Middle East, and other cultures in Asia, that I don't speak Japanese, I don't speak Chinese, I don't speak Arabic, but still, most of them, when they come here, they're fluent enough in English that they're able to understand the language fairly well. And another thing that's very important is being able to set the expectations from the start. That is crucial. Many people don't understand how we do it here, and that's very important. That's the number one key in being able to have a successful inbound transaction with an inbound foreign buyer. They have different buying habits. They don't come from a culture where they do not have, for example, they don't have a buyer's agency. They don't have representation. They don't have an MLS. They don't have exclusive rights to sale and things like that. So that all falls into the education part. That to me is the most serious challenge that we have when we're dealing with a foreign buyer, is educating them, teaching them how we do it here. Because remember, they come from a different culture and they are not necessarily used to how we do things here. They don't believe, or they don't know that we have a system for valuations, like we have the appraisers and things like that. We have the MLS that gives us information about the current market values of the properties. The measurements, they come from a country that uses a metric system. We don't use the metric system here. We use feet and yards and miles. And every other country in the world uses meters, square meters, square centimeters, and they use kilometers and things like that. So we have to also be able to set their expectation in terms of being able to transfer or change or convert a square footage on a MLS listing to square meter listing or a square meter explanation. For example, they tell you, I want to buy a 200 square meter condo, and you go like, well, how much is a 200 square meter condo? Well, one of the things we're going to show you is that it's a very simple way to do that. And you can divide it by 11. There's a magic number, which is 10.7639, but round it up or round it down to 10 or 11 is an easier way of doing it. So if they tell you, I'm looking for a 200 square meter property, what you do then is you multiply by 11 or 10, whichever is easiest, and that would round it up to, say, 2,200 square feet. And that makes it a lot easier for us to understand exactly what they're looking for. All right, communication, just like we're dealing with a domestic buyer, they want to be able to communicate with you, the buyer, the agent, on a consistent basis. So we have to be able to tell our buyer that we are there for them, and that they're able to call us anytime. If the buyer is located in another country and you don't have the ability to start dialing direct for international, there is a couple of technology things like WhatsApp and Skype that are really easy to set up and be able to communicate with your client literally for free. Of course, then you got to deal with legal issues. you'll find that some buyers are going to ask you a bunch of legal questions, and the first thing that we have to remember is that we cannot give legal advice. So we always end up referring legal questions to an attorney, whether it's immigration issues, or they might ask you, well, what's the best way to purchase this property? Do I buy it as a individual ownership, or do I buy it as a corporation, or do I buy it as a partnership? Those are the questions that we cannot answer because it depends on legal issues that and on their particular specific personal needs, and it does require legal answers. Okay, let's talk about cultural differences. In most of the countries that we are dealing with foreign buyers, there is a lack of representation. They do not understand the concept of agency. There is no agency. There's no concept of buyer's representation or buyer's agency. So when you start talking to them about, I can represent you, I can work for you, you don't need to start looking at 7 or 8 different agents from 7 or 8 different franchises to work with you. They need to understand that concept, and I think that's one of the hardest things to be able to explain, because they do not come from a culture that has real estate practitioners. In many of those countries, anybody and everybody can claim to be selling properties. So taxi drivers, the maids, the waiters, the guy in the corner that sells hot dogs and things like that. Everybody is a practitioner in many countries. There is no real estate guidelines or real estate licensing in many of the countries where a lot of these buyers come from. And another thing is that in many cultures, they buy in consensus. That's something that you're going to have to get used to, because you may end up having to show the property to several family members at the same time. It's not like showing a domestic buyer that you might end up showing him one property and then they'll say, yep, this is the one. They will see the property and then they want to bring their mom and dad, and they want to bring their cousins, and they want to bring the elder of the family to come and take a look at the property. And I'll tell you quickly a story that happened to me. We were working with a very well, highly educated Asian buyer. She was a petroleum engineer, and we went through the process. She purchased a home. We were in the option period, and during the option period, she asked me, I would like to show my mom and dad the house. So we said, sure, no problem. We figured, that's no harm done, right? Well, we showed her the house, and then the next day, we showed the mom and dad the house, and then the next day she called us and told us, I'm sorry, but my mom and dad told me not to buy that house. So what do you do? Well, fortunately, we were still under the option period, so we were able to cancel the contract without much harm. But just be aware that some things like that are possible, and they don't happen to us all the time, fortunately, but be aware that some things like that are possible, because apparently she should have consulted with her mom and dad before pulling the trigger on that particular purchase. Language. Speaking the same language helps, but it's not mandatory, not required. I was just mentioning that most people that come here will be speaking English, and but having the ability to speak their language helps, or understanding their culture helps more so. If you do not have the ability to speak the language, or they can't speak our language, then you bring a translator into the picture. And if you are using software such as translation software from many providers online, you want to recheck it for syntax, for tense errors, because they can really mess you up. So be very careful when you're doing software translations and sending out emails. Have somebody else who can speak the language proofread it for you to avoid embarrassing situations. I recommend it strongly. The other thing is evaluations. Most of these coaches come from an area or a country that does not have an MLS, so they don't have a verifiable data like we do. So they come in here and says, well, and they'll ask you, well, let's say you're looking at a $350,000 property, and they'll say, well, why don't you just offer 300? And you're going like, why? Why are we going to lowball these people when the market price is X? The best thing that we have, which is also the hardest thing to prove, is showing them comparables and telling them that the market data that we have is verifiable, and it is called, the MLS solds, and that is what tells us what the values of the market are. And that is one of the hardest things for the buyer to accept, because they come from a culture that does not have that data. And many of them are still not going to believe you, but I promise you that once you start explaining something to them, I have learned, one of the things that I learned early on in my real estate business when I was working with foreign buyers and with domestic buyers, is that people will trust and follow what you can logically and tangibly explain. If you can logically and tangibly explain that we have an MLS, if you have logically and tangibly explain the benefits of representation, they're going to trust you and they'll follow you. It's just as simple as that. So here's the other issue with in many countries, the municipal government, the city government, will require an appraisal, whether it's a cash transaction or not. And that's how they determine the value of a property for tax purposes. Let me say that again. Here in the U.S., we do not require an appraisal for cash properties, for cash purchased properties. But in their home countries, they do have to have an appraisal to be able to tax the property accordingly. So keep that in mind. I know, remember that 47% of the buyers are buying in cash. So it's a welcome issue when they realize that they do not have to have an appraisal done, and that the appraisals are done actually by the county, or they have already been done by the county, and that information is already in the appraisal district's database. And of course, in some of those countries where they have valuations, regardless of whether it's a cash deal or a finance deal, the appraiser's estimate is final and binding. We have some flexibility with that. We might be able to challenge, if we're in the selling side of a transaction and we end up getting an appraisal which is much lower than the property, or if we're in the buyer's transaction, in either way, we have the ability to challenge that or question it and request another appraisal. But in many of those countries, an appraisal is final, and that's the culture where they're coming from. So that's another thing to be aware of. Set the expectations from the get-go, from the very start. When you're sitting down with them in the very first meeting, define your role and make it very clear who you're working for. One of the things that we do is we're having a conversation with a buyer, and we tell them who are we working for. We're working for you. My job is to represent you, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer. If we do not enter into a representation agreement according to the laws of the state of Texas, we end up working for the seller as a subagent. That's one of the things that we have to explain to them also. I have a system that I'm going to share with you in terms of my role, your role, because that's what's going to take us to the next, which is the education. That's the most important thing. That's the most challenging thing you're going to do, is doing the educate. So I cannot emphasize how important it is to tell your buyer everything and explain to them everything clearly and explicitly. So this is how we start. I have two printouts. One of them is called My Role, and the other one is called Your Role. So in My Role, I give him a copy, and we go over this in our first meeting, because this is the importance about defining the roles and expectations. First thing I have to do is tell him, my job is to treat all parties fairly and honestly. Number two, we always can ensure that we keep a win-win relationship. Why is this important? In many cultures, believe it or not, they do not have this concept of win-win. Many cultures believe that if I'm going to win, you have to lose. Or if I'm going to lose, you win. So if you win, I lose. So that's one of the hardest things to explain to a foreign buyer, is that we have this culture in this industry that we can achieve a win-win relationship in every one of our real estate transactions. We tell them we're going to be on time for all meetings. That's very important, to be on time, even if they're not. We will promise them to communicate with openly and frequently. You're going to be hearing from me almost on a consistently basis, at least once a week or 2 or 3 times a week when we're dealing with a transaction. This is also very important. I'm going to represent your best interests in all negotiations. I'm going to represent your best interests in all negotiations, Mr. Buyer or Mrs. Buyer. And of course, you also have to tell them that we have to schedule the showings, because many of them don't understand and they think that you can just walk into a property. Well, that doesn't work that way, does it? So try to walk into a property and then it has an alarm. Then what you do? Yeah. And of course, we'll continue with my role. I will show you, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, only the homes that meet your criteria, which is why we have to we had a previous conversation as to exactly what is it you're looking for. I omitted to include my criteria sheet, but you all have, I'm pretty sure when you're dealing with buyers, you have a criteria sheet that you discuss with your buyer. So that's the same. Use a criteria sheet when you're dealing with an incoming foreign buyer. Should not be any different. Another thing that we will do, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, is assist you in the document review. Once we put an offer on the property, and then you explain to them that the offer becomes the contract. In most other countries where they're coming from, the offer is one thing, and then the contract is another thing. It's 2 separate documents. The offer can be prepared by the brokerage, but the sales contract or the purchase contract has to be prepared by an attorney in those countries. Then not so in here. We have the fill in the blank forms. That offer becomes a contract when everybody signs off of it. So that's a big thing that many people do not understand, and you want to explain to them that that's part of the job that we do. And then, of course, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, I promise to respond to and resolve all your issues quickly and timely. This is what you call your value proposition. This is one of the things that many agents do not do when they're talking to a buyer, whether it's a foreign buyer or a domestic buyer. There really isn't much of a difference in terms of setting up your value proposition so that they sign up with you as a buyer's rep. Because the only major difference is that you still have to explain certain things to them in more detail. But when you're dealing with a foreign buyer and a domestic buyer, you still have to present your value proposition. And this is one of the best ways to do it that I have found. Now, let's go to your role, Mr. and Mrs. excuse me, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer. We expect you to be on time to all meetings. And this is very important because most of the foreign buyers come from a culture which is the high context culture, which is has this belief that time is fluid, meaning that if you have already worked with some foreign buyers, you tell them at 10 o'clock and they'll show up at 10:20, 10:30, 10:45, because that's the way they are. That doesn't mean that you can be late. No, we all still have to be on time. But when you tell them that I expect you to be on time for all meetings, and after they show up late on that first meeting, they squirm a little, they squirm a little bit, and then they start apologizing. Oh, I'm so sorry, blah, blah, blah. But they end up being on time for the next meeting. I promise you that. That's part of the setting of the expectations. Keep all appointments. Call me if you have to cancel, but call me in a timely manner. We understand that conflicts might come up, things come up, the kids get sick, whatever. But we have to keep our appointments. And if we cannot do it, just call me. We can cancel or reschedule. Loyalty. It's very important, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, that you are willing to work exclusively with me. And are you comfortable working exclusively with me? And then I go into my loyalty thing. Let me just go back for a second. Let me just jump into this slide here because this is important. This is my loyalty promise. I have memorized this and I use it with every buyer, foreign or domestic. I will commit myself to find you your ideal home. And now I must ask you, are you willing to work exclusively with me? And by exclusive, I mean that if you see a yard sign, you call me. If you see a billboard ad, you call me. You see an ad on an online newspaper, magazine, or a regular newspaper, you call me. I also request that you do not solicit the services of another agent while I am working with you in helping you find your ideal home. Do you think that's fair? I will guarantee the best service, and all I want in exchange is your exclusive loyalty. And you know what, ladies and gentlemen, I have found that this conversation has saved me a lot of pain and misunderstanding, and to the point that it is really a lifesaver, because one of the things that you find out is that if you explain these things to them, they are going to be loyal to you. So going back to the role, one of the other things that I tell them, inform me immediately if your criteria changes. Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, you have the right to change your mind. If you don't like this neighborhood or you don't like the price range, it's okay. You don't have to, you don't have to worry about that. We can just change your criteria if you want to. And then finally, let's have fun and enjoy the process. Don't make it too ornery, because you don't want to scare them off and you don't want to spook them or anything. Just tell them, we're going to have fun. We're going to enjoy the process. We're going to help you find the right home. Okay, so here's a loyalty promise again. And I end up, this is the loyalty promise, okay? We end up with, in exchange, all I want in exchange is your exclusive loyalty. One more thing. Oh yeah, one more thing. This is the Columbo close. Oh yeah, one more thing. I'm going to need your written permission to represent you. Now, this may apply if you are in a brokerage that you are required to sign a buyer's rep agreement. To me, this is the most important thing when you're dealing with a foreign buyer, because you're telling them something that you are required to do in a non-threatening, non-challenging, non-confrontational way. Gee, gosh, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, one more thing. I'm going to need your written permission to represent you. And 9 times out of 10, they will say, yes, not a problem. Where do I sign? Because over here, you're telling them, please do not solicit the services of another agent while I'm working with you. Do you think that's fair? You have to wait for an answer. Do you think that's fair? Working exclusively with me, is that fair? If they say yes, great. If they say no, you ask them, why not? Then that's when it comes out, right, ladies and gentlemen. That's when they tell you, well, I'm working with 3 other agents. And it's just, that's fine. But you need to decide which one you're going to work with. So if you want to go ahead and continue to interview those other fellows, let me know. But if you want to work with me exclusively, I'd be very happy. But if you're not, then that's fine. We'll just shake hands and stay friends. But if you decide to work with a buyer who's still working with 2 or 3 other agents, that's the best thing about the business. This is your business, and that's, you run it however you see fit. But I have learned that if I do not get them to confirm their loyalty and sign a buyer's rep agreement, for goodness, for my protection actually, I'm taking a very high risk. So be aware of that. So further education. If you have any questions, remember to post them on the parking lot, and I'll address them as we're done. Further education. If you have heard of the CIPS, Certified International Property Specialist designation, but have not taken that course yet, please do so. This is the course that's going to help you create more awareness. It's going to give you the tools, the knowledge, and the insight to be able to work with foreign buyers, incoming and outgoing. It's also going to help you create your network of CIPS designees throughout the world. There's like 4,200 CIPS spread out throughout the United States and the rest of the world. Many of them are in Canada, Europe, Asia, Jamaica, places that we may currently be having people calling you and asking you, can I buy a property for retirement in Panama? Can I buy a property for retirement in the Caribbean? Can I buy a property for retirement in the southern France? These are the things that the CIPS Institute is going to help you do. So we are teaching this. We just wrapped up a course here like 3 weeks ago. And we are probably going to schedule another CIPS course here in Houston at HAR Central, probably sometime around June or July. So watch for it, and I recommend that you sign up as soon as the course is available. Okay, so you have any questions? There's several resources that you can use from NAR. NAR has a tremendous amount of resources, and these are available to you from the NAR website. Research. They have news and information. They have educational seminars and courses. There's a Realtor.com International where you can post your properties. They have partnerships. NAR has also events, and they will also give you support for the international transactions. So if you have any questions, this is my contact information. I'm available almost 24/7. But you write me an email, I'm sure we'll be able to answer it a lot quicker than a phone call. So now, do we have any questions? Okay, nobody has any questions? I'll give a couple of minutes. Anybody has any questions? Oh, by the way, we're going to be recording this. We have recorded this seminar, so if you know people who could have, but were not able to take it, tell them it's going to be available online. We're going to post it through a YouTube video, and then it's going to be available on the HAR.com website. So. Right, yeah. Our staff member here, Marilyn, is going to send you an email. That's a follow-up email on that one. Oh, folks, if you don't have any other questions, I am going to say thank you very much for your time. And I hope to see you in a CIPS course in the very near future. Okay? All right. Thank you very much, folks, and take care, and good luck with your buyers and your sellers.